Trains. Ginormous, smoking, heavy metal monsters that roar and scream as they fly down a bed of stone and iron. That's at least how we see trains today. Now imagine a train smaller than the car you can drive. Now throw dozens of corpses into its freight cars. That was the sight soldiers of World War I tended to see. World War I primarily made use of makeshift railroads, laid down by hundreds of soldiers in days. These lines would be rough, uneven, poor quality, but expendable. Because of the no man's land these railroads had to get through, they decided to use a smaller type of railroad than what you normally see. These are what you would call narrow gauge railroads. What you're used to seeing are standard gauge railroads. Narrow gauge is much smaller. The rails are laid closer together, the engines and cars are smaller, and everything tends to work well on rough terrain and tight corners. Because they use fewer resources in being built and were easily used on rough terrain, they could build more of them without concern. The narrow gauge railroads used in World War I were called trench railways, or sometimes War Department light railways. These trench railways originally used French locomotives, as they were proven useful on the French terrain already. However, when Germany marched through northern France, the troops were cut off from all their railway supplies, including their engines. Due to the loss of these locomotives, several manufacturers around the world were sent the blueprints for these engines, to build their own interpretations of them, which would be sent off for the war effort. The most famous of these engine types were built in America. These were called the Baldwin 10-12-Ds. They were mass-produced in America, then shipped straight to Europe. Being as small as they were easy to transport by ship, and over 280 of this type of engine alone were built. A funny side note, 2 were lost at sea due to general incompetence aboard the ship they were on. Once shipped to Europe, these engines were thrown around and sent straight to work. The railroads had very few jobs. Meet at the larger railroad, load up resources, rush the resources to the troops at the trenches, or near the trenches, load the bodies into the now empty wagons, and get the blazes back to safe territory. When building the trenches, the trains would often carry soldiers to the trenches. However, they'd often be overflowing out of every single wagon to bring as many people as possible at once. However, if a train was hit by a shell, or damaged, or derailed by any means, it would most likely be left to rot, and the soldiers would continue by foot. All of this, however, is only half the story. War Department light railways were the unsung heroes of the Western Front. However, the Eastern Front was an entirely different story. The Eastern battles of Germany and Russia were on far larger ground. The battles were mobile. Despite Russia's poor railway infrastructure and near no funds available to invest in better equipment, Russia out-teched the famous, or infamous, German engineering. Russia took designs from the American Civil War, mounting guns on heavily armored rail cars. Soon, each train that roared through the soot and ashes of the battlefield was armored from end to end. One car in front would be mounted with around 16 different guns. Cars behind the engine, which would also be armored, carried fewer guns, but more supplies. The front car, having a larger supply of guns, was to blast debris off the track, so Germans couldn't simply block the tracks with rocks, as they had done previously. The fewer number of cars was so if one was derailed, it wouldn't hold up the rest of the train. It could easily be left behind. Another reason for having fewer cars was due to the heavy armor placed on both locomotive and wagons, severely weighing it down and reducing pullage capacity. While the Russians had great success with continued use of their armored trains, Germans struggled to create anything but the railroad equivalent to a little red wagon with a pistol in hand. The Germans would later get a grip on how to work a railway, but this wouldn't happen until the war was already over with. So how did railroads adapt during the war? On the west, smaller narrow-gauge railroads were laid for quick use around the trenches and supplying resources. New types of engines were developed for quick use and easy maintenance. In the east, standard gauge locomotives were armed to the teeth and blasted their way into battle or went to the breaker's yard trying. Massive development in military railroad equipment was made, which both benefited railways for years to come and led to far greater weapons on wheels in World War II.